Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 13 in Sociology of Death and Dying. This week we are talking about greener alternatives to traditional, aka modern burials. So we will go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is your chapter for this week from your assigned book for this unit, From Here to Eternity. And this chapter focuses on California and talks about some kind of alternatives to traditional burials and gives kind of two very different examples, right? So they talk about two very different options for green burials. The first option that they talk about is a green burial plot in Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica. There are several green burial plots and green burial cemeteries throughout the country now. And they give this one as an example, right, in California, in Santa Monica. And they talk about how this is a very kind of sought after place to have a green burial and in this green cemetery, but it's also very expensive, right? Incredibly expensive. It can be several $1,000s, if not more. And then they contrast that with kind of your DIY green burial, where the legality of this one may be questionable. But they talk about Mrs. Shepherd's funeral in the desert in Joshua Tree. Once again, kind of very DIY, very kind of underground, not to pun intended, but off the grid, kind of going rogue, for very cheap, right? They were just putting her body into the ground basically without kind of permission and without any kind of, designated permits or anything like that. So giving two very different examples of green burials. In this chapter, they also talk about this tradition that fits in this kind of category of alternatives to traditional burials, and talking about Tibetan sky burials. So this part's really fascinating. Hopefully you got a sense of their description of Tibetan sky burials, or Caitlin Doji's description in this chapter of sky burials. Really, really interesting. This is a practice that we'll talk more about on the next slide, but in the chapter for this week, they mentioned that in Tibet, this very sacred practice of performing sky burials and sky kind of funerals is been increasingly disrupted by what we call thanatourism, which is what it sounds like. We talked about thanatology in this class, right? Thanatourism is death tourism. So we have a lot of people from around the world, from outside of Tibet, that will come to Tibet and take photographs, take videos of these sky burials, because it is so kind of unique, right, and different. So there's this like natural inclination to want to pay attention and capture these things, but they talk about how Tibet as a country and as a people, Tibetan people really struggle with like what to do about this thanatourism around their sky burials and what it means for the ritual. They talk about how as of 2005, I should say, the Tibetan government banned sightseeing, explicitly banning photography and videography of sky burials, but it still happens, right? So we can still, and I do not encourage you to necessarily participate in this by searching on YouTube, but you can, if you do come across examples, there are plenty out there of people illegally taking videos of these sky burials. So it still happens despite the Tibetan government having banned this practice. So a little bit more about sky burials. This is kind of a traditional Tibetan temple where a sky burial might take place nearby on a mountaintop. And Tibetan Buddhists specifically engage in this practice. They believe in the transmigration of the soul. And so the sky burial is this kind of ritualistic process where the body is placed on a really tall, usually at the top of a tall mountain peak, and purposely exposed so that animals can consume the body. And usually it's vultures that end up consuming the body. And so it's considered an act of generosity among Tibetan Buddhists, and an act of generosity giving back to animals, to the land, that allows for this transmigration of the soul to take place. Okay. Some of the other things I want us to talk about this week on topic of thinking about alternatives to kind of traditional burials is this kind of category of green death practices. So when we use this term green death practices, we typically refer to a couple things. Specifically, we're talking about environmentally sustainable death practices. We're also often talking about woodland or natural or ecological burials specifically. So we're going to talk about 4 challenges associated with this broad category of green death practices. The first challenge is kind of wordy, but basically this first challenge is getting at the need to balance the rights of individuals and communities to grieve in the ways that are important to them, that align with their values, basically honoring individual prerogatives, right, in terms of how we want to grieve our loved ones, with also simultaneously needing to balance concerns and considerations around, sustainability and environmental concerns. So really trying to promote green burial, but not trying to suggest that it should be for everyone, especially if it's not congruent with people's values and their needs. The second challenge with green burials is that, green burials specifically, in this case, as a form of green death practices, green burials specifically also encounter land capacity constraints, right? So even if we're burying somebody or people in the ground and not using chemical embalming and, engaging in much more environmentally friendly practices, we still run up against, in a lot of places, this issue of having limited land capacity. The third challenge associated with green death practices, is that grave recycling can be and probably is important for sustainability purposes, but it's not legal in North America. And for good reason, right? We're not suggesting it should be, but just to point out, and this one's kind of connected to number 2, right, that usually when we're selling somebody a plot, whether it's in a traditional cemetery or a green cemetery, that plot is sold in perpetuity with the idea that it's theirs and their families and their loved ones' plot for all time, forever. So we don't recycle graves. So we're still kind of coming up against this issue of, land capacity use constraints, but also, not engaging in what would be a more sustainable long-term practice if we were to engage in this practice of recycling graves. And then lastly, and this is kind of pointed out in your chapter for this week in From Here to Eternity, right, that fully green cemeteries are often inaccessible. They're often very, very pricey, hard to find, and there's only a handful throughout the United States. And so it's not really super realistic for everybody, or even a large percentage of people. Okay. Now I want to talk about some of the kind of legality issues around green death practices. So this is from an article called Watery Grave that talks about some of the legal issues and kind of the main overarching argument of this article. And this is something we see as a pretty significant problem in the funeral industry at large, is that there's really a lack of federal legislation that covers all states that addresses burial methods and what is legal and what is illegal. So basically the law can and does differ depending on where you live, not only what state you live in, but can be even as specific as what county you live in, and that there are very few, if any, kind of overarching federal laws. So this is a big problem, like I said, in the funeral industry as a whole, and especially when we're talking about kind of some of these alternative practices to traditional burials, it can be a real legal gray zone. So when we're talking about green burials and legislation specifically, there are no state laws that specifically prohibit green burials. But once again, the legislation is a little bit murky. So even though there's no state laws against green burials, there is kind of a lack of updated legislation that provides any kind of framework or would provide any kind of framework for cemetery owners to offer green burials within the confines of any, kind of clearly documented laws. So there just aren't any clearly outlined procedures for how to operate a green cemetery, for instance. And as with, the lack of federal legislation, once again, what we do see is a lot of inconsistent laws in different states about what's legal, what's not legal, from everything from, cemetery operation, funeral business operation, to disposing of bodies and what the laws are, and whether or not you can and under what circumstances transport bodies across state lines, we see just a lot of variation and inconsistencies. Another set of issues that this article talks about is a lack of public knowledge around green funeral practices, green death practices in general. So in this article, they cite a 2018 survey that was conducted by the National Funeral Directors Association. And this survey had some pretty interesting findings. So one of the main findings was that about 54% of Americans said that they were considering or would consider a green burial. So this is kind of encouraging, right? A little more than half of Americans said that they were considering a green burial. But in the same survey, they found that only 48% of Americans knew that embalming is not required for cremation. And so based on these kind of pair of findings, the funeral professionals claim that this kind of demonstrates that there's a lack of awareness and a lack of resources for implementing green burial methods, right? If people don't even recognize kind of what is and is not involved in cremation and green cremation or any type of cremation, then it sort of points to this lack of public knowledge. All right. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about is this process of alkaline hydrolysis, aka aquamation, kind of a tongue twister, but alkaline hydrolysis or aquamation is kind of a green alternative to cremation. So there's this short video. I encourage you to watch it. It's very informative. It talks about the process of alkaline hydrolysis. And it's a process that involves combining 95% of water with 5% lye in a piece of machinery and applying pressure and heat and simultaneously circulating the liquid, similar to cremation, but instead of involving heat, we're using water and lye to basically dissolve body parts and have the bones be kind of grinded down on their own, or I should say as part of this process, right? So it's, once again, this process that combines 95% water, 5% lye in a piece of machinery with heat and pressure and circulating the liquid. Very similar to cremation. And the cost is very similar as well. This gives you an idea of where it's legal. It's interesting. The cremation, the sort of traditional funeral industry, and as part of that, cremation services, companies that offer cremation services, has really heavily lobbied against legalizing alkaline hydrolysis because it does, potentially cut into their profits quite a bit. So it's a threat to the traditional funeral industry. So as response to that, the Funeral Directors Association has lobbied pretty heavily to not legalize alkaline hydrolysis or to keep it from being fully legal in certain states. I'm not going to test you all on where it is and is not legal, but it is kind of fascinating to look at. This just shows a map. It's a map made by the Canadian Crematorian Association, so it includes Canada as well. But Canada and the US, you can see like some different legality across different areas where only in a few states in the US is it fully legalized. Those are the states represented in the striped kind of white and blue. But in the states that are just solid blue, we have active practitioners, and in states that are gray, we do not. Okay, to end today, I just want to talk about two different countries with some unique practices in terms of funeral traditions, largely born out of a response to some of these environmental concerns and practical concerns that we are running up against with burying people. So the first example is South Korea, and they have this unique tradition now of burial beads. And this tradition is born out of a conundrum where basically in 2000, South Korea passed a law that required graves, to be removed after 60 years due to limited space, right? And so unlike the United States, which we talked about earlier today, that has, that does not involve or engage in practices of grave recycling, South Korea now officially does, and they kind of have to as a result of having limited space. And so as a result, as you can imagine, the popularity of cremation skyrocketed in the last couple decades, right? So more and more people are being cremated in South Korea. And this is one service that's being offered that has become kind of a newer tradition and ritual, which is to create burial beads out of people's cremated remains, create these gem-like stones, and then to display them in your house or in your place of residence. And so this is just a really fascinating kind of, like I said, example of a newer tradition that was born out of some direct environmental concerns. Here's a video if you are so inclined to learn more about this. And then finally, wanted to kind of end on another kind of fascinating note of looking at funeral traditions around the world. We have this example from Ghana of fantasy coffins, where when a person dies, they tend to have very large funerals, large celebrations of life that involve the entire community. And we have coffins that are often made by local craftspeople that are personalized to the person's life and to reflect something about them. So this example is obviously a giant fish. It's a coffin made to reflect the deceased person's occupation, which was a fisherman. So this is very common, is a coffin that would represent the person's occupation or sometimes their passion or hobby. But it's another example of just rich funeral traditions around the world. And if you're so inclined, here's a really interesting video about the making of fantasy coffins. Okay, so in conclusion, just to kind of wrap up what we're talking about this week, when we're talking about, what to do with people's bodies or after death, how to honor people, how to honor traditions, how to, respect the dead, all of these things. Just this kind of quote that shows, right, that there is no perfect way, there's no perfect law, there's no perfect solution, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't attempt to engage in more environmentally friendly practices than what we're currently doing. So that is our end point for this week.